Welcome back, everyone, to week 13 and the start of our third and final unit. So, our third unit will focus on the developments of art in the 20th century. Now, here is kind of our prompt question for our third unit and what's going to lead our lectures and the way that we focus in on art movements. And that is, what was the relationship between art production and war in the 20th century? Now, I wish I had kind of a more uplifting topic for our third unit. Unfortunately, it's impossible to look at art production without looking at the deep impact, both positive and negative, that the wars of the 20th century had on both artists, arts communities, and the population as a whole. So that's what we're really going to be focusing in on. And we're especially going to be looking at the psyche of artists. How are artists reacting to the changes of the 20th century? All right. And the other announcement that I wanted to make, and I've sent out an email, hopefully by now, but I also wanted to tell all of you that are watching this video, is that we will not have a Unit 3 project, so no artboard project for our final unit. And the reason for that is that I am well aware of how difficult it is right now in our present moment to be focusing in on our schoolwork. I know many of you are essential employees that are out there working. I know many of you are caretakers, and I know that time is limited. And so I really want you to focus in on your exercises to catch up on any work that you perhaps might have fallen behind on, and really do everything possible to get your grade up so that when I go to enter final grades, I can get everyone the grade that they deserve. And so I'm hoping that by eliminating this third unit project that we're able to do this. All right, so let's get into our topic, which is the 20th century. We're going to look at Fauvism, Expressionism. We're also going to take a look at Russian abstraction, and I'm going to introduce to you the black square. And you will never look at art the same way ever again after looking at the black square. As just a side note, in this unit, we will also be looking at photography, which is a topic that many of you have mentioned. So we will look at film and photography in this unit. All right. So here is a general timeline, and we have seen so many different types of art movements so far in our class. So we talked briefly about the Middle Ages before we hit the Renaissance, but we really started our class in the Renaissance here. And you can see how it very orderly went Renaissance, Baroque, Rococo, Neoclassical, Romanticism, Realism, Impressionism, Post-Impressionism. Well, what's going to happen in the 20th century is it's remember I mentioned it was almost like a pendulum. You went from like one side to the other, right? And it was kind of on an even keel. And I saw somebody mention in the comments that why did realism only last a couple years, right? Like why so short when you look at the Renaissance or Rococo, I mean, or the Baroque, and they lasted much longer. Well, what we're going to see is as we get closer to the present moment, the art movements sometimes get shorter and they start overlapping with each other. So we'll see that Fauvism and Expressionism at one point overlap. We're going to see how Cubism, Futurism, Dadaism, Surrealism, Abstract Expressionism, pop art, all of these are going to overlap and they're going to come in run after the other really quickly. And so it's a lot harder to look at a neat, orderly timeline when you talk about modern art, right? And we usually refer to modern art as starting in the 19th century. So generally, we start with Impressionism as kind of the birth of modern art, right? And modern art, by the way, is going to take us all the way to the 1950s or so, which is where we're mostly going to end this class. All right, so here is the political world in 1900, and it looks a lot more like it does today. However, colonialism is still very strong during this time, especially in parts of Africa and Asia. So just keep that in mind. Now, in terms of, like I said, there's a lot of different art movements that we're going to look at, and they all kind of overlap. So I want to talk in broad strokes. What are some characteristics of early 20th century art? Well, we're going to see a move towards abstraction of objects and subjects, right? This means everything is going to get abstracted, and we'll talk more about abstraction. I think next unit it's early abstraction, so we'll talk about what exactly that means. We're going to see pictorial space and perspective lose importance. So everything that we learned about in the Renaissance, remember how I said those rules would be with us up until the 20th century? Well, we're here, and those rules are broken now. You can see in this painting here, there is no sense of depth, right? It's incredibly flat, so we're losing all sense of depth, or at least it doesn't make any logical sense like the Renaissance 1, 2, 3 point perspective did. Color and line are going to become arbitrary, and we're going to see this especially with the Fauvists, right? And this is a piece of Fauve art, and you can tell it's a Fauve piece because the color makes no sense, and that's the whole point. And we're going to see artists start breaking all of the rules in art history, all the rules that we set out to establish in the Renaissance. The 20th century artists are all about breaking those rules. Let me hide this thing. I know it's annoying. All right. So, Fauvism. What is Fauvism all about? Fauvism is kind of this celebration of color, of the freedom of art. Now, I mentioned we were going to talk about photography later on, right? But photography is one of the major developments that is going to influence abstraction, because artists no longer have to paint things as they are, because photography can just do that. I mean, photography at this point is not colored photography, but it can record real life. And artists now have the freedom to paint whatever they like. And that's an amazing amount of freedom to have. And what we see with the Fauves, this is by Henri Matisse, The Joy of Life. So at least I have something beautiful and uplifting to share with you today. This piece is really about a celebration of color. And the Fauves basically said, if I want to paint the giraffe purple, I can paint it purple, right? We all had that experience in like kindergarten where we wanted to paint things whatever color we wanted, and somebody came around and was like, giraffes aren't purple. You can't paint them purple. Well, the Fauves are saying, we need to connect kind of with that childish spirit and just paint whatever we feel. And that is the key word here. Whatever we feel. Because when you look at a painting like this, it's really all about feelings, right? So we went from realism, impressionism, that was very technical, and now we're back to getting in touch with our feelings, right? So you're going to see that come up again, especially with the expressionists. It's about expressing yourself as an individual, as an artist with the capital A. Right? Here we see another landscape. And these always just make me smile because I love color. I love bright colors. And I love the idea of just kind of painting as you did as a child. And by the way, they were called the Fauves. They're kind of like they're called the Beasts because, again, critics really hated this work. They were like, what are they? They're like wild beasts painting. And that's kind of how they got their names. And again, this art movement did not last very long. And the reason it didn't last very long was unfortunately World War One. I mean, it's hard to celebrate the beauty of color and light and life, right? The beauty of life when you're stuck in the middle of a world war. All right. The other art movement that I wanted to talk about, which again comes right at the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century, it is Art Nouveau. So Art Nouveau has different names in different places. It starts in really in France and Vienna, and it's really strong there. It goes all the way. I mean, if you visit Mexico City, they have Art Nouveau hotels there. It is found in South America, in parts of Asia, as well as kind of that influence of especially architecture and design. But in Spain, it is also called the Modernismo. So if you look at Art Nouveau in Spain, it has its own name because Spain always has to do things their own way. Well, this art movement comes at the fin de siècle, which means the end of the century, and it sought to celebrate nature. So it's a bit of romantic, kind of like the neo Gothic that we looked at, but it's not necessarily tied to the past. It more wants to reconnect with nature in a world that becomes ever more industrialized. The followers of Art Nouveau wanted to surround themselves with nature. And so what you see is very modern 19th century and 20th century materials like steel that we talked about, but in these very organic and sinuous shapes. So it's a mix of the organic with the industrial. And it's one of my favorite architectural styles because I love anything that is organic. So, just so you know, this is also happening in the background of everything else we're looking at. And then there is expressionism. So, expressionism is especially strong in Germany, right? So, this is Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, and you can see in these pieces the abstraction. I always, when I look at these pieces, I'm looking at like crows and birds. They almost look bird like to me, which not everyone sees. Like you might see something else, but that kind of abstracted, they've been elongated, right? There's no longer any sharp edges here. Their eyes are kind of these wide black stripes, and their faces are very angular. And I brought the Kirchner piece here just to introduce it. You're going to watch a video on it, a documentary in the next section, to show you how artists are expressing their emotions during this time, right before the First World War in Germany. There was a lot of anxiety about the economy, about politics, about what this new technological industrial world was going to look like. A lot of the anxieties that we have even today, right? A lot of anxiety about the modern age. And he really portrays that through his use of color and line in his work. I mean, it's hard not to look at this piece, which again uses color in a really interesting way, but it's much darker and has a deep sense of anxiety compared to The Joy of Life by Matisse, which I showed you a few minutes ago. Then we hit the First World War, right? And again, I'm going to show you a couple of German artists. So the first is Otto Dix. And Otto Dix, again, we're going to look at kind of how artists react to the reality. And this is something that I've been talking about now for a couple of weeks. Otto Dix fought in the trenches in World War One. And World War One is often overlooked by historians and the general public. It's really hard to wrap your head around like the actual war, because if you look at it, it was just a series of alliances that made this incredible world war break out, but it was never like one massive thing that happened. And so in a lot of ways it feels like a senseless war. I mean, all wars are senseless in my opinion, but especially this one. We also see new technologies, the same new technologies and materials that helped create the beauty of impressionist paintings, and new steel structures are now being used for murder. So you're going to see biological warfare, right? And this is why they have those masks, because of especially of mustard gas. And so Otto Dix fought on the front line. He saw the horrors of war. And he is very much a realist in that he is portraying what he sees, right? He does not gloss things over. but he is an expressionist, and we put him under the umbrella of expressionism because there is so much deep emotion being portrayed in his work. And you'll also, I think, see him in the documentary I'm going to show you. But this is perhaps one of the darkest and deepest portrayers of war that I've seen. And then on the other side of things, here is another man that fought in World War One. He fought in the trenches. And this is a man that instead of painting the realities, the horrors of war that he saw, he instead turns to the beauty of nature and to spirituality. So this is Franz Marc. And Franz Marc, even through all of the horrors of the First World War that he experienced, deeply believed in spirituality and in the beauty of the world in which he lived. And you can see that in the expressive use of colors. So if this piece has been completely stripped of all color, of all humanity, of all beauty, you look at this and it's a completely different interpretation of this time in history. So this is 1911. He goes on to paint several of these horses throughout the First World War. He paints some foxes. It's very much a bright use of color. The shapes are always very soft and sinuous. They're very elegant, and they're very hopeful about a moment after the war, life after the war, right? So we're going to switch gears, and I have another comparison for you in this last example. So this is looking at Russian abstraction, early Russian abstraction. And these two pieces are by two very different artists working roughly around the same time period, but one very large event happens, and that's the event I just mentioned, the First World War. So on the left, we have composition number 7. Yes, because as abstraction takes hold, artists start calling their art pieces just number 7 or number 8 or lines or something like that. They have much less descriptive names, which, thank you, we do not have slide memorization quizzes, so you don't have to memorize all the names to abstract pieces. But this is composition 7. It's incredibly famous because we consider it now the first completely abstract piece. So it's not abstracted like that Kirchner piece that we saw earlier. It is completely abstract. It's non-representational. Now, as you look at it, you could probably find shapes, but that's just because our eyes love to find shapes. Now, you would not be surprised to know that Vasily Kandinsky was very much a lover of music. He was a lover of Russian culture and art, and he very much believed that we were on the edge of a new spiritual age. Right? So again, artists that in a time of political unrest, of crisis, turn to spirituality, right? And you can see this, his use of color, it's very hopeful that things are going to be amazing soon. But it's also right before the First World War breaks out and before the Russian Revolution. Now, we have on the right the infamous, the most famous, the black square. Yes, you are not seeing this wrong. It is actually a white canvas with a black square painted on. If you see some texture, that's just because the paint has crackled. But it is quite literally a black square painted on a white canvas. Now, many of you might be like, how do you do an art analysis? How do you even write about such an abstracted piece of art? And that is a good question. I have a video that is going to look at this. And I love this particular analysis of the black square because it is so over the top. It's a little bit funny, and it's okay if you laugh as he's analyzing this piece, but it hits it right on the head. This piece is revolutionary, and Malevich was a revolutionary. So this is painted in 1915. The First World War is already happening. We are on the brink of the Russian Revolution. People can feel it in the air. And this is Malevich's reaction to it. Right? Now, there's a lot of different ways that you can read this piece. Is it a statement about society? Is it a statement about what he's feeling in the present moment? Right? There's so many ways that we could analyze this piece. I'll let the art historian in the documentary do it because he's a whole lot more dramatic and interesting than me. But just kind of keep these two pieces in mind again for those comparison and contrasts ways of analyzing art, right? So you have pre-war, after First World War. You also have different individuals. Somebody that's spiritual, somebody that is all about the revolution and about how we are in this very dark moment in history. And so I hope these examples kind of help you better understand what expressionism is all about, because expressionism, it looks very different depending on the artist, but it really is all about expression. And you're like, wait, what about post impressionism, and what about romanticism? Those were all about like expression, right, and emotions. Yes. What's different in the 20th century is first, the level of abstraction that we're going to see, the use of color in this expression, and thirdly, it's about personal expression. It's not so much about what the king is feeling or what the revolution is feeling. This is about the individual and the way that they are processing all of these changes that are coming in the 20th century. Well, I'm going to wrap up there. I'm trying to make these videos shorter because I realize that listening to a recorded lecture is not the most scintillating thing, but I really want to give you some framework and some background before you watch the documentaries in the next section. All right. So next week, I think we are looking at early abstraction. And so I will see you all then.